Thank you very much. Good evening, one and all. When I heard about Knesset and when people spoke to me about it, then I said I have to choose a topic because the topic is national resilience. So I said, so in that case, maybe we ought to redefine that national resilience. And when I speak about those topics that I deal in my daily life, I discover that there are sufficient people who have not really internalized that social is economic, and they tally with each other. First of all, that I think that each player on the field, whether he's an old or new player, they have their role, and each is doing what is anticipated of them with that passion. And we find ourselves in a kind of storm. But I think that the characteristics of what we're saying is that there is verbiage, lots of words, with lots of meanings, but very little content. For example, the word unity. Now, who doesn't want unity? And what about social justice? Who could possibly oppose that? New politics. After all, we all want something refreshing. So national resilience has a really distinguished position in all that. And after all, this has so many meanings, but it is also somewhat a vacuum. They're no longer the vacuums of those farmers who look to the horizon. We now understand that social solidarity is a prerequisite for national resilience. Now, what is that? I mean, if you talk about security resilience, of course, then it's easy to understand. And then the discourse about it, unfortunately, have still stuck with cliches about various issues. In other words, we're still stuck back there when we talk about capitalism and socialism. And when in a Western world there is a monetary policy that is really changing all its policies and with a zero kind of interest. Here, we're now talking about protection of local produce. And on the other hand, is this a socialistic country? Is it a communist country? Just last week, a representative of Alibaba visited us, and believe me, he didn't exactly convey a socialist message. So let us also talk about economics and forget these cliches and let us really carry this out into action. How can I do that? So I'll give you 3 examples of a necessary deep change that we would like to see happening. Now, if I will go present other issues, and I think you all know that I'm talking about public housing and social services and the small businesses and the closing of the gaps between the periphery and the center. But now I want to do something slightly different, something that is deeply rooted in our discourse. And these must change. It isn't an issue of right or left or center wing, but rather those who the stakeholders who feel that they would like the conditions here and the circumstances to remain the same when they should be shaken. In other words, that settlement, the arrangement, the settlement law has allowed people to allocate resources behind the scenes and blur the path between actually what is said behind the scenes and what actually happens in the field. Now, there are those who really feel that this is a vocation, that what they need to do, and I don't want to cast aspersions against them, but they shouldn't be doing so in order to promote their own vested interests. That money, the transfer money, is taking money that should be given to the residents of this state, the citizens, and instead they're taking money for their own interest. Now, even if the actual defense budget remains as is, there's still enough money. That's news, isn't it? But in order to really be able to get the real money that they need, it should be totally transparent to the public about what the alternatives to that budget are. There shouldn't be a a fait accompli presented to the public. Not at all. So if things could be done with slight changes done to it, it shouldn't be done in the margins. They should actually tell them what the goals are and really work on them. Now, the defense system knows how to present sort of the various the sort of modus operandi. And at any rate, I'm going to give you some examples, something that is very close to me, which is a public housing. They often help people in there paying their rent instead of actually buying things for things, and everything has been, all those flats that have been sold have been moved into actually other hands if we're talking about the renovation of various public housing, and people have moved from one place to another. But this isn't an instruction of actually by the government, but rather various public civil servants who have actually given this order or that other. So basically, yes, there aren't flats, but there are those who are actually eligible for them. So how does the government deal with it? They participate in their rent. What is the percentage of participant? 2 billion shekels per annum. What does that mean? It means actually move them to the actual strong deciles instead of the actual weaker deciles. That is what they're doing. So I can talk to you about poverty and the fixation of distress and crisis. But believe me, I think it should be done in a completely different way. There should never be slums. I think that the topic that we ought to spearhead is education and employment. Not in a way that weakens and sort of fixates the deciles, but in a way that we can promise the actual future generations a way of extricating themselves from this poverty. And I would like to say that because that they will be the future entrepreneurs, teachers, doctors. So you can tell me with so many examples about all those who did know how to break out. It's true. There are so many that did know how to fight out and do know how to extricate themselves. But there are some so many who have been left behind. And let us talk in economic terms. How much does this burden cost the economy? Now, the Ministry of Finance, actually, he talks about the long-term prices. If we invest in one family and we extricate those children and family from becoming a burden, and we turn them in a way into a real economic unit that will contribute to the GDP, that is an asset. One can quantify that. So even before we're talking about the issue, the moral commitment that we have to think about what it will do. Because if we do not do that, it is really an economic crime. So I know in our cynical world, it may seem something very far-fetched, and even for some in the audience, but I'll give you another example. Wherein that actually makes each of us sort of feel that we suffer in each of our family units. We're talking about life expectancy being lengthened now. In 20 years' time, 1,700,000 will have continued living an additional number of years. Now, at some point, the interim generation find that we're a kind of sort of sandwich generation, that we're not only bringing up our children, but we also, it is our moral obligation to look after our parents as well. If you look at the large state controllers report about how people treat their aged and senior citizens in the community, things are not working properly, and it is a lack of sophistication in their policy. This should be a focal point, and there should be alternatives. In other words, they should be left for longer times near their families, these senior citizens. All this costs money, but we ought to measure these issues. At the moment, I will present a really organized, extensive program in the future. Now, before preparing the actual state budget, we have to have a real deliberation about the policy, wherein we have quantitative discussions about what needs to be done and lessons learned about how we allocate those actual budget in all on the budget lines. Nothing is hidden behind wonderful words, but very few deeds. So it is the true role of the Ministry of Finance is to flood alternatives so we can actually give prices to them and decide what then can be implemented. And there are these questions like changing the various supports of various domains in each of the local authorities. I mean, you can actually accuse people of lack of responsibility in various issues. One should bring a budget without that discussion. That is lack of a responsibility. You have to look at the state controller's report, and if we really scratch the surface, we'll find the criticism about the true neglect of how this budget is actually submitted. Now, believe me, I've seen how things work in the corridors of the Knesset, and I know how things can be destructive. One of those destructive forces is whatever happened in the past is what should happen in the future as well. In other words, it doesn't matter what your political opinion is. They have to be allocated in exactly the same way without asking questions. Well, the time has come to ask questions and to receive answers. Why, for example, the development of infrastructure is carried out in such a wasteful manner and not synchronized between the various arms of our government? Why is there so much money in education and yet the results are not impressive? We ought to analyze how there are weaker population enclaves created and the government not only doesn't help them, but it even causes difficulty every year from breaking through and extricating themselves from poverty. It's all based on political compromise. Well, in our society, one can understand that that's part of politics, and there are compromises that emanate from decisions that are made ahead. But there should be a compromise that is just a kind of payment of a kind of corrupt manner of people keeping their lips closed, their mouths closed, and there should not be reciprocal kind of bribery going on. Everything should be transparent in front of all the actual factions and parties. There's so much going on behind the scenes in such a surreptitious manner that we don't actually realize how it is being done. It is done really in the little rooms in camera behind the scenes. They sort of sit there together and they vote. Yes, so we have lived with this for a long time, but unfortunately this is a strategic threat against our national resilience. Who actually comes up with an upper hand? It is nearly all of the political parties know how to use their levers until it has become a second nature. We have to dismantle these forces as quickly as possible. It is possible because the government in the future that I will be part of, it will be done transparent in a transparent manner, with quantitative object, and it should be cross-partisan. It should be in such a way that there should be a synchronization of all the systems. Only based on that should a budget be decided upon. And this actually approach is acceptable in every responsible household, just as it should be done in every country. I think that this should be a national approach. Perhaps the moment we do it, we won't understand how we didn't live without it beforehand. How on earth could we have? So maybe this may seem naive in a certain way, but I understand the sectorial party's strength. Of course, it's legitimate. It's part of the game. It's part of democracy. But you'd be surprised to hear that on the day my approach for actually submitting a budget will be implemented. You'll see it'll be done because they really see that not all that money arrives in the hands of the actual people in those sectors, but rather in those activists behind the scenes. That is what we want to rectify. The second topic that we have to pay attention to is that we should move from a position kind of budget to a value budget. because we bow down to tycoons and conglomerates. This must end. We should not be dictated to by those stakeholders and those tycoons. We should create a dynamic environment that supports people who work hard in order to create value. With our high tech that we're so proud of, justifiably so, without the enormous investments would have taken place. Isn't that part of what the public actually did? Didn't they exert those energies? Could all of this happen without it? That kind of tailwind we ought to take and think about industry. Yes, perhaps textile industries won't, and places of employment won't be created, but things are changing. If we're talking about artificial intelligence and robots, all this could lead to a new kind of industry, and Israel must invest what is necessary in order to encourage this kind of training of such people. So this really has an immense influence on our economy. You have to do things for the sake of free trade, and this must be done. You have to continue with this discourse and focus on those objectives, and we have to encourage the actual small businesses. We want to expand those circles so that people will import knowledge, so that actually smaller businesses will be developed here without just actually striving and hoping for business across the sea. Now, the issue of tribes, that's the last issue. Can we actually give in to this dismantling of the unity of our people? This approach, sometimes when we talk about multiculturalism, is basically what is gnawing away at our resilience. This is one nation that is for everyone, and we want full equality of rights for everyone. We have not finished building our state. After all, it is just starting. It's still in its embryonic stages. For many years, there were those who actually just carried out an offense, actually drowning the weaker link. So we have to understand and agree on the direction that we need to head towards. There is sometimes a feeling that we should just give up. No, the real national resilience says we have to go back to the foundations of Zionism and Judaism. We are one people. And this impulse to just isolate themselves in their little tents has brought us to a terrible spot. It is necessary that a Haredi poor young boy is not their problem, or a single mother's little child who is fighting for the resources is not only a single mother's problem. A child who lives in an unrecognized village and gets dirty, unpotable water, it's not just their problem. We have to look at this mosaic, and you cannot just lean on symbols, but on the sense of belonging, the hope. It is one nation, it is one mosaic that should reunite. I've been working for over a decade in the Knesset, fighting battles in the corridors and behind the scenes in order to create a stronger and healthier society. And I know what needs to be done, and I know more than that. I know what needs to be done in order to fight and come up with an upper hand in this entire war. And believe me, this is a true war, a battle for those, that there are those who are sitting near that tap of resources and drinking it all. But their time has passed. I feel that this new wave is coming from the households, from the neighborhoods. What happened in the past is not what will take place in the future. And I promise all those who have heard me talk, please join my ranks and join us. It's not only for our national resilience what we are fighting for, but it is for our present and our future here together. We have a national responsibility, accountability that we have to fulfill.